Payback times.
The envelope was wrong before I even touched it. I noticed it the way I notice most things in this room, peripherally, through the particular alertness that 3 decades of appraisal work has trained into the back of my brain. It was sitting on the corner of my receiving table, propped against the base of the brass letter scale my grandfather brought back from a Port-au-Prince estate sale in 1974. The postal carrier sometimes slides pieces under the back door when the front is locked, which I have asked her 4 times not to do. But Thursday evenings in October, when the French Quarter is thick with tourists and the light through the transom windows goes gold and watery, I am usually the only one here. I almost didn't look at it. The Haitian ironwork collection on my work table demanded attention. 12 pieces, including what I suspected was a ceremonial vevey gate panel in the Oghou tradition, mid-1800s, provenance partially documented through a Port-au-Prince notarial archive. I'd been corresponding with for 6 weeks. The metalwork was extraordinary, heavy and intricate, the kind of work that makes your fingers want to trace the forms, even through gloves. I'd been cataloguing in the particular silence that only comes after 8 o'clock in this neighbourhood, when the tour groups have drifted toward Bourbon Street and the building settles into its own old sounds. The hiss of the climate control system, the faint creak of cypress joists overhead, the smell of linseed oil and aged iron, and the ghost of my grandmother's gardenia perfume that I swear still lives in these walls. I was cross-referencing the gate panel's rivet pattern against a catalogue from the Musée du Panthéon National Haïtien when I glanced at the letter scale and registered certified mail. The green and white card was still attached to the front. I set down my reference catalogue. The envelope was standard legal size ivory, the kind institutions use when they want to signal seriousness without ostentation. The return address label in the upper left corner read Pelican Trust and Securities, Poydras Street, New Orleans. I know that logo the way I know the seal on my own professional certifications. Pelican Trust is the custodian bank for the Thierry-Beaumont Heritage Fund, my grandmother's trust. I picked the envelope up carefully, white cotton gloves still on from the ironwork examination, and turned it over. The certified mail recipient line read Caldwell Heritage Ventures, LLC, and beneath that a suite number, 412B, at my building street address on Royal Street. There is no 412B in this building. There is no suite numbering system at all. We are a single occupancy historic commercial property with a second floor residence. We have been here since 1961. I turned the envelope back over and looked at the window. Panel, that small translucent rectangle that lets you see the top portion of the document inside without opening the envelope. What it displayed instead, because the document inside had shifted, was something else entirely. Wire transfer authorization, and below that, partially visible but unmistakable in its formatting, the trust account number I have memorized the way I've memorized my own telephone number, and a dollar figure, $340,000, and at the bottom of the visible portion, a signature line, my name printed beneath it, and above my printed name, a signature. I set the envelope back down on the brass scale with the same deliberateness I use when setting down antique glass. I pulled out the stool from beneath the table and sat. The climate control system hissed. Somewhere on Royal Street, a trumpet player was working through a slow, mournful version of something I couldn't quite identify. The smell of linseed oil was very present suddenly. Very specific.
I had not signed any wire transfer authorization this month.
I had not signed one last month. The last document I signed in relation to the Heritage Fund was a quarterly review acknowledgement in July, which is a formality, a one-page summary of fund performance that Preston's office sends over via DocuSign. I sign it the way I sign a restaurant receipt. A habit, I realise now, sitting in my own workroom with my gloved hands flat on the table. A deeply, dangerously comfortable habit. I thought about the gate panel on my work table, the way a forged piece often looks right at first glance, the way it takes someone who knows exactly what they're looking at to find the small wrong things, the rivet pattern slightly too regular, the oxidation distributed incorrectly, the weight just fractionally off. I thought about how forgeries are almost always made by someone who understands the real thing well enough to reproduce the surface, not the substance, never the substance. Then I thought about Preston Caldwell III and the way he'd laughed at something I said at lunch 2 years ago. That lunch at Galatoire's, the white tablecloths and the Friday afternoon light and the bourbon-glazed sweetbreads I'd ordered because I was nervous, which I don't do often enough to explain it. Preston had laughed and touched the stem of his wineglass and said, "Solange, you are exactly the kind of client I love working with. You understand value. Most people don't." I had been flattered. That was the precise word for it. 50 years old, 3 decades of professional expertise, and I had been flattered. The trust was Mère Céleste's creation, my grandmother's last and most deliberate act of institutional legacy building. She died 3 years ago at 89, having spent 60 years acquiring, documenting, and preserving artifacts of Creole and African American cultural heritage that the mainstream auction market routinely undervalued or simply ignored. Quilts, ironwork, devotional objects, correspondence, photography, furniture made by free black craftsmen in the antebellum period. The collection she built is housed in a climate-controlled suite on the 2nd floor of this building, and it is, by any serious scholarly or monetary measure, irreplaceable. She established the Heritage Fund 18 months before she died, working with her longtime attorney, Gustave Melançon, to set aside $3 million specifically for acquisition and preservation of additional pieces, the digitization of existing documentation, and occasional loans to museums and cultural institutions. She was very clear about the fund's purpose. I have read that trust document enough times to recite sections of it from memory. What she was less clear about, or perhaps what I was less clear about on her behalf, was the selection of the fund's investment advisor. Gustave had managed Mémère's financial affairs for decades with quiet competence, but he was 73 and frank about his limitations in active investment management. He recommended 2 names. Preston Caldwell III was one of them. At the time, Preston was a senior portfolio manager at Meridian Private Wealth, which handled old money Louisiana families with the kind of discreet authority that reads, in certain circles, as an endorsement in itself. His presentation was immaculate. The suits were made to measure. I noticed because my grandfather wore made-to-measure suits, and there is a particular way the shoulder sits. He knew the collection. He'd done research before the first meeting, and he referenced 3 pieces by name, correctly identified their cultural context, said all the right things about stewardship and long-term value, and the importance of mission alignment. He also mentioned, more than once and with precisely calibrated casualness, that he managed funds for 2 of the oldest families in St. Charles Parish. We gave him discretionary authority over non-liquidation investment decisions. It seemed reasonable at the time. It seemed like the sophisticated choice for a serious fund. Gustave had reviewed the contract and nodded his careful approval. The clause was standard for an advisor relationship, he said. Standard. I know now what I should have pressed harder on then. Discretionary authority is not the same as unlimited authority, but that is a distinction I understood academically, professionally, in the context of other people's estates, not my own. I stood up from the stool, walked to my desk in the corner of the appraisal room, and found my personal records notebook in the left-hand drawer, the one with the dark green cover that I've kept in various versions since I was 26 years old, a habit my father instilled in me. Every significant professional observation, time-stamped, initialed. My father called it armour. I had always thought he was being dramatic. I photographed the envelope with my phone. Front, back, window panel detail. Timestamp on. Then I opened the notebook and wrote the date, the time, and a precise description. Certified mail envelope, Pelican Trust and Securities return address. Recipient listed as Caldwell Heritage Ventures, LLC, Suite 412B. This address, no such entity or suite exists at this address. Wire transfer authorization, visible through envelope window. Heritage Fund account number, amount $340,000. Apparent signature on authorization line. Identified as mine. I did not sign this document. Then I sat back down and picked up my phone. Pelican Trust's main line goes to an automated system after 5 o'clock, but they maintain an after-hours line for account holders on their premium service tier, which the Heritage Fund qualifies for. I dialed it. The associate who answered sounded young. Mid-20s, I thought, from the slight formality of someone still learning to modulate a professional telephone voice. I gave him the account number, my name, my identification credentials. Then I asked him to tell me about the most recent wire transfer activity on the account. There was a pause, the kind of pause that has information in it. Ms. Thierry-Beaumont, he said, the most recent transfer was authorized 3 days ago, $340,000. Authorized by whom? I said. Another pause. It was authorized under the investment advisor's discretionary authority clause. The signature page reflects the account holder's standing authorization. He was reading something while he spoke. I could hear it in the slight delay between phrases. How many transfers of this type have been made in the past 14 months? I said. The silence this time was longer. I'd need to pull the full transaction history. I can see, a brief pause, the sound of keyboard clicks. I'm seeing 4 transfers in that window, including this one. 4 transfers in 14 months. I did the arithmetic without moving. What is the total value of those transfers? I said. I really should have the senior relationship manager. What is the total value? I said again, and I kept my voice exactly level, which is something I have learned to do over many years of delivering unwelcome appraisal results to people who do not want to hear them. He told me, then he told me, the receiving account designation on record for each transfer, which was listed as a portfolio reinvestment account. Standard language, the kind that doesn't raise flags in routine review. I thanked him, told him to make a note of the call on the account record, and asked him to ensure that no additional transfers were processed pending a full account review that I would be requesting through proper channels in the morning. He said he'd make the note. He didn't sound entirely sure he could stop anything tonight. I didn't push it. That was tomorrow's work. I hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in my lap. Then I went to the built-in shelving along the east wall where I keep reference files, and I found the folder I was looking for between a 2019 insurance appraisal binder and my copy of the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. The folder is labelled in my own handwriting, Heritage Fund, Governing Documents. Inside it is the original trust instrument that Gustave Melançon drafted, the Investment Advisory Agreement, and the Custodial Account Agreement with Pelican Trust. I took the folder to my work table, moved the Haitian ironwork to the side cart with the careful attention it deserved even in this moment, and sat down with the trust document. I have read it before. I have read it the way you read something you understand, and therefore read quickly, looking for the familiar landmarks. Tonight I read it differently. The trust instrument describes Preston's role in specific language. Investment advisor. Fiduciary capacity, those two words together, constitute a legal designation that I know as well as I know the difference between a legitimate Newcomb pottery piece and a reproduction. I have explained it to clients more times than I can count over the years. I explained it once to a widow in Metairie whose stockbroker had churned her late husband's investment account, trading repeatedly to generate commissions while the portfolio value eroded. A fiduciary isn't just someone you trust, I had told her. It's someone the law holds to a higher standard of loyalty than any ordinary contract. A regular contractor can pursue their own interests as long as they fulfill the contract terms. A fiduciary cannot. They are legally required to act solely in your interest. Not primarily, not mostly, solely. She had looked at me and said, "Why didn't anyone tell me that before?" I thought about that widow now, sitting in my own appraisal room with my grandmother's trust document in my white-gloved hands. I thought about the particular quiet that surrounds a mistake when you finally see it clearly. Not the noise of panic, not the heat of anger, but the clean, cold recognition of a thing precisely as it is. Preston Caldwell III is the named fiduciary of the Thierry-Beaumont Heritage Fund. That designation obligates him, under Louisiana trust law and under federal standards applicable to investment advisors, to act solely in the interest of the fund and its beneficiary, which is this firm, this collection, this legacy. He is prohibited from using fund assets to benefit himself or any entity in which he has an interest. He is required to disclose any conflict of interest. He is prohibited from self-dealing. Caldwell Heritage Ventures, LLC, at a non-existent suite number at my business address, with wire transfers totaling just over $1 million, routed through a portfolio reinvestment designation, and a signature on an authorization form that I did not sign. The trust document used the word fiduciary with the confidence of a legal instrument that assumed the designated party understood its weight. I had assumed it too. That was the precise compound error, not that I had failed to understand the term, but that I had trusted the term to do work that only oversight could do. I am an expert in other people's estates. I have spent 30 years knowing what questions to ask about other people's fiduciaries. Tonight, in this room that smells of linseed oil and my grandmother's legacy, I understood something about the difference between professional knowledge and protected knowledge. One I had always had, the other I was going to have to build. I photographed each page of the Trust Documents Advisor section with my phone. I made additional notes in the green notebook. I cross-referenced the receiving account designation the junior associate had mentioned against the investment advisory agreement language, noting where the discretionary authority clause began and ended, and more importantly, what it did not authorize. At 11:14, I locked the envelope and the trust folder in the firm's fireproof document safe, the same safe where we keep provenance documentation for the collection's most significant pieces. I noted the time in the green notebook, Then I reset the security system and stood in the appraisal room in the dark for a moment, the ironwork collection a row of beautiful shadows on the side cart. The gate panel would have to wait until morning. The provenance question I'd been working through with such focused pleasure 3 hours ago now felt like it belonged to a different evening entirely, a quieter one. I picked up my phone and found Dominique Arsenault's name in my contacts. Dom and I have been friends since Tulane, where she was already the person in any room who read every document before she signed it and then read it again. She built her practice on estate litigation and trust administration, which means she has spent 25 years in courtrooms and boardrooms and probate hearings, learning exactly how badly wrong a fiduciary relationship can go and exactly what can be done about it. Her voicemail picked up on the second ring, her voice businesslike and slightly impatient even on a recorded greeting, which has always struck me as perfectly appropriate. "Dom," I said, "I need you in my office first thing tomorrow. Bring your reading glasses and don't tell anyone you're coming." I hung up. Outside, Royal Street was doing what it always does on a Thursday night. The music from the bars 2 blocks over, the low murmur of foot traffic, someone laughing at a pitch that carries. The French Quarter has no interest in anyone's emergencies. I have always found that quality either comforting or bracing, depending on the night. Tonight, I found it clarifying. I tucked my phone into my jacket pocket and looked at the fireproof safe in the corner, its small red indicator light steady in the dark. Inside it, my grandmother's trust document sat beside an envelope addressed to a company that shouldn't exist, carrying a signature that wasn't mine, from an institution that should have been watching. Not panic. I checked myself for panic the way I check a piece for damage. Methodically, in good light, with professional attention. What I found instead was the thing that always comes when I finally understand what I'm looking at. Preparation. Dominique Arsenault arrived at 7:43 in the morning, which meant she had driven from uptown without stopping for coffee. That meant she had understood my voicemail precisely. I had the documents laid out on the appraisal table before she knocked. The misdelivered envelope rested in a clear archival sleeve. The trust instrument lay open to the advisor provisions. The investment advisory agreement displayed the discretionary authority clause, flagged with a strip of yellow paper. My green notebook sat open to the entries I had made the night before. Beside all of it, my printed log of 14 months of communications with Preston Caldwell. Every email, every voicemail transcription I had typed the same day, every meeting note. I keep those records for every significant professional relationship. My father's habit, my armour, he called it. Dom came through the back door I had left unlocked and dropped her briefcase on the floor with the authority of someone who has never been tentative about entering a room. She looked at the table. She is 54, 2 years older than me, with the close-cropped natural hair she has worn since our Tulane years, and the reading glasses she claims she does not need on a chain around her neck. She picked them up now, settled them on her face, and bent over the table without sitting. She did not speak for 6 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock above the shelving unit, the old enamel-faced one that has hung in this room since my grandfather's time. Dom reading is a focused, silent thing, like watching a very still animal that is nonetheless completely alive. Finally, she straightened. "Walk me through the call with the bank associate." I did, from memory, which she knows I can do accurately. When I finished, she took the investment advisory agreement and turned to the second page. "Look at this clause," she said, and set the document flat in front of me, her finger on a paragraph I had read before, but, I understood now, had not read correctly. Discretionary authority for individual transfers not to exceed $500,000 requires only the advisor's written notation in the transaction log, not co-signature from the account holder, not written authorization from the trustee. She looked at me over her glasses. "That is not standard language, Solange. That was negotiated. Someone asked for that." The room was very quiet. The climate control system ran. Outside, Royal Street was doing its early morning routine. A delivery truck reversing, a shop gate being rolled up, the particular sounds of a city neighbourhood coming awake. "Gustave reviewed the contract," I said. I heard how it sounded as I said it. An excuse that explained nothing, because Gustave reviewing a contract and Gustave understanding what he was being asked to approve were not necessarily the same event. I had known that professionally, about other people's situations, for decades. Gustave is a real estate and probate attorney who was 73 years old and trusting a recommendation he had made in good faith, Dom said, not unkindly. Preston knew that. He came into that contract negotiation knowing exactly who was reviewing it and what they were likely to catch. She picked up the envelope in its archival sleeve, turned it over once, set it back down. "You have been deliberately kept in the dark. The clause structure was designed to ensure that transfers of this size could move without triggering your review or your signature. 4 transfers at $340,000 apiece keeps everything comfortably below the threshold." I had already done that arithmetic, but hearing it said aloud in Dom's courtroom voice produced a different physical response than thinking it alone had. A specific nausea, precise and located, the kind that comes not from fear, but from recognition. I had been charmed into a contractual blind spot. The Galatoire's lunch, the made-to-measure suits, the careful research into the collection, all of it had been preparation for that clause. Not for the relationship, for the clause. "Tell me what a civil action looks like," I said. Dom pulled out her own notebook, the leather-bound kind she carries everywhere, and uncapped her pen. Louisiana trust law recognizes fiduciary duty as a legal relationship with specifically enforceable obligations. To prevail in a civil action for breach, we establish 4 elements. She wrote as she spoke. First, the existence of a fiduciary relationship. That is documented. He is named as fiduciary in the trust instrument. Second, a duty owed. Also documented. The instrument specifies his obligations, including the duty of loyalty, the duty to avoid self-dealing, and the duty to act solely in the beneficiary's interest. Third, a breach of that duty. The wire transfers to an entity in which he holds an interest, rooted under a forged or unauthorized signature, constitute breach on multiple grounds. Fourth, resulting harm. $1.1 million in diverted funds constitutes harm. "You said forged or unauthorized," I said. I said it deliberately. We do not know yet whether that signature was forged or whether Preston obtained some form of authorization through fraudulent misrepresentation, telling you that you were signing something else, for instance. That distinction matters for the criminal referral. For the civil action, either way is breach. She looked at me. We also have a parallel track available through FINRA. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, I said. If Preston holds a securities license, and at Meridian Private Wealth he almost certainly does, He is subject to FINRA oversight. A complaint filed with FINRA triggers a regulatory investigation that runs parallel to civil litigation. They have subpoena authority over his firm's records that we do not have in the early stages of a civil filing. And a FINRA complaint on record affects his professional standing immediately before any court makes a determination. Dom tapped her pen against the notebook. We file both. Civil action for disgorgement of all profits from the unauthorised transfers, plus compensatory damages. FINRA complaint for the regulatory record. Disgorgement, I said. That means we can recover not just the principal, but whatever he earned from it. Everything he made by using your grandmother's money as his personal investment vehicle. Yes. Dom closed her notebook. But before we file anything, I want a forensic accountant with eyes on 14 months of trust statements. I need the full transaction map before we put anything in writing to any court or regulator. Do you have the account statements? Pelican Trust sends them quarterly. I have them filed. I crossed to the document shelving and pulled the Heritage Fund folder, not the governing documents folder I had reviewed the night before, but the financial records folder behind it. I have been getting them and filing them. A pause. I have not been reading them carefully enough. Dom took the folder. That stops today. I am also calling Marcus Fontenoy. I knew the name. Forensic accountant, trust and estate specialty, had testified as an expert witness in 2 of Dom's cases that I was peripherally aware of through the professional network that connects estate attorneys and appraisers. How soon can he look at this? Dom was already reaching for her phone. He will make time. He owes me a favour from a Baton Rouge probate case that I will never stop reminding him of. She found the contact and looked up at me before she dialed. Solange, this is going to get harder before it gets easier. I know, I said, and you are going to be angry. You might already be angry, in ways that will try to make you move too fast. Do not. I know, I said again, and I meant it both times. Marcus Fontenoy came to Dominique's office that afternoon. She had insisted we move the working sessions there for attorney-client privilege over our communications. The location told me she was already thinking about litigation posture. His office was on Carondelet Street, close enough that he arrived with his laptop already open and a legal pad under one arm. He was younger than I expected, late 30s, with the slightly distracted energy of someone whose mind operates a little faster than the conversation around him. He shook my hand, looked at the stack of trust statements Dom had spread on her conference table, and sat down without ceremony. Give me 2 hours, he said. Dom and I went to the small ante-room and drank coffee and talked through the clause language again, more slowly this time. Dom explained at each turn what a jury instruction or a regulatory filing would make of specific phrases. I asked questions. She answered them. This is how I have always learned the things I needed to know, not from courses or textbooks, but from proximity to people who understood systems I was navigating for the first time. I asked precise questions and listened to precise answers. It occurred to me, sitting in that ante-room, that this is exactly what Preston had done with the trust contract. He had been close to someone who understood the system, and he had asked very precise questions, and what he had learned was how to hide. Marcus came to the doorway at the 2-hour mark and said, "Come look at this." He had built a chart on his laptop screen, a timeline running across the horizontal axis, dollar amounts on the vertical, with the Trust's quarterly acquisition budget shown in blue and 4 red data points representing the wire transfers. The visual was immediately, almost shockingly clear. 4 transfers, he said, totaling $1.1 million, all routed to Caldwell Heritage Ventures, LLC. Now look at the timing. He pointed to each red marker in relation to the blue budget periods. Every transfer correlates with a month when the Trust's legitimate acquisition budget should have been active. The Trust has a semi-annual acquisition window, 6 months of the year when the investment strategy calls for deploying capital toward new acquisitions per the fund's stated mission. Every single transfer happened in one of those windows. He looked at me. He was not stealing randomly. He was substituting his own fees for actual acquisitions. The Trust was buying nothing. He was billing it for everything. I looked at the chart for a long moment. 3 years of what Preston had called positioning for long-term acquisition opportunities. 3 years of quarterly reviews at which he had used careful, resonant language about stewardship and strategic patience. 3 years during which my grandmother's trust, the instrument of her life's most deliberate intention, had purchased nothing, not a single piece, not one quilt, not one photograph, not one object of the cultural heritage she had spent her entire life defending. I set my coffee cup down on Marcus's conference table and looked out the window at Carondelet Street. The anger Dom had warned me about was there, but it was not the hot, impulsive kind. It was the cold, structural kind. The kind that does not make you move too fast. The kind that makes you very, very thorough. What was Caldwell Heritage Ventures incorporated as? I asked.
Delaware LLC, Marcus said. Incorporated 18 months ago. He scrolled to another screen. 8 days before Preston was formally appointed as the Trust's investment advisor. The room was quiet for a moment. He built the vehicle before he took the appointment, Dom said. 8 days before, Marcus said again, with the flat precision of someone who has learned that the right facts, stated simply and without editorializing, do all the work editorializing cannot. Premeditation. The word arranged itself in my thoughts with the quiet finality of a key turning in a lock. This had not been opportunism, a fiduciary who encountered a temptation and failed to resist it. This had been a plan. Preston Caldwell III had incorporated a company, established its purpose as historic property acquisition consulting, and then walked into my grandmother's trust appointment, carrying that company in his pocket like a second set of keys. The lunch at Galatoire's, the research into the collection, the name-dropping of St. Charles Parish families, all of it preparation, not for a professional relationship, for a mechanism. What do we still need? Dom asked Marcus. His original engagement letter, if there is anything in it that contradicts the trust instrument's fiduciary designation. His ADV form, that is his disclosure filing with the SEC, registered investment advisors are required to file it, and it will tell us whether he disclosed Caldwell Heritage Ventures as a potential conflict of interest, which he did not, because if he had, we would not be here. Marcus tapped the table. And the internal transaction records from Pelican Trust. We can subpoena those once we file the civil action. But I want Dominique to send a formal written notice of disputed transactions to the bank's compliance department immediately, today, so there is a record of when they were put on notice. Already drafted, Dom said, and pulled a folder from the pile on her right.
I looked at my green notebook,
which I had brought in my bag. I have 14 months of email correspondence with Preston. Every voicemail I received from him, I transcribed the same day and logged it. Every meeting note. I set the notebook on the table. I kept them as professional practice. I kept them for every significant client relationship and every significant vendor relationship. I did not keep them because I suspected him. Marcus picked up the notebook and began reading the first entry. "You should have been a forensic accountant," he said without looking up. "She should have been an attorney," Dom said from the other end of the table. "She should have been trusted by the fiduciary she hired," I said, and both of them looked at me. Then Dom made a small acknowledging sound and went back to her draft notice to Pelican Trust. I called Theodore that evening from my car, parked on Magazine Street outside Dom's building, watching the streetcar move through the late
afternoon light. My cousin Theodore Thierry is 61, retired from the New Orleans City Archives after 32 years, and constitutionally incapable of dishonesty. It is either his greatest professional attribute or his greatest social liability, depending on the context. He has attended every quarterly Heritage Fund review meeting since the trust was established, because Mère Celeste asked him to, and because Theodore takes the weight of a dying woman's request seriously in a way that most people have stopped being capable of. He knows the collection better than anyone alive except me. He wept at 3 pieces in the recent ironwork acquisition, which I considered an entirely appropriate response. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he was home, and not at his garden, where he rarely hears his phone. "Solange," he said, "I was going to call you." That stopped me. "About what?"
A pause that had something complicated in it. Preston Caldwell contacted me last week. He asked me about my personal savings. He said he was developing something he called a parallel investment vehicle for culturally aligned clients. Theodore's voice had the carefully modulated quality of someone managing an emotion they consider too large to simply express. He described it as adjacent to the work the Heritage Fund is doing. He said the returns on the fund had been strong enough that he wanted to offer the same opportunity to people in our family's circle. I held the phone against my ear and watched the streetcar stop and release its passengers onto the neutral ground. A woman with 2 grocery bags, an older man in a seersucker jacket, the city doing its indifferent, ordinary things. He used the trust as a proof of concept, I said, not a question. He was recruiting me, Theodore said, and now the emotion was audible, not quite anger, something older and more wounded than anger, betrayal. The specific variety that comes from discovering you were not seen as a person, but as a resource. I have not given him anything. I was going to ask you about it first, which I should have done the moment he called me. A beat. Tell me what is happening. I told him. I was precise and complete, and I did not soften the numbers. Theodore has never thanked me for softening things, and he did not need it tonight. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then, I have the email he sent me. He described the vehicle in some detail. He called it a historic property acquisition consulting entity. He said it was already operational. Can you forward that email to Dominique Arsenault tonight? I can forward it in the next 5 minutes. And Theodore, I paused. Do you remember the quarterly meetings? Specifically, the things Preston said at those meetings about the fund's acquisition strategy. I remember every meeting, Theodore said, with the offended precision of a man who who spent 32 years in archives. I take notes. I have taken notes at every meeting Preston has ever run, because I take notes at everything. Do you want a signed affidavit? I almost smiled. The armour my father gave me, Meme gave Theodore in a different form. Yes, I said, I want exactly that. Can you come to Dom's office tomorrow morning? He came at 8 o'clock and spent 2 hours with Dom, drafting his affidavit. It detailed 4 separate quarterly meetings at which Preston had explicitly represented that the fund was actively seeking acquisition targets, that the acquisition budget was deployed in pursuit of the fund's stated mission, and that the Trust's cultural stewardship goals were the primary driver of every investment decision. Verbal representations that directly contradicted the fund's actual inactivity. 0 acquisitions in 36 months. And he brought the email.
Dom read it twice without speaking, then held it up and looked at Marcus across the table. He describes an entity whose stated purpose is historic property acquisition consulting. He says it is operational and producing returns. He solicits a family member of the Trust's beneficiary for investment capital. She set the email down. He was using the Trust as a demonstration model to recruit additional victims. The word victims landed in the room with a particular weight. Marcus was already typing. This changes the FINRA complaint package significantly. Solicitation of investment capital using falsified performance records from a fiduciary account he controls. That is not just breach. That is the architecture of a fraud scheme. He looked at me. I want to run a search on Caldwell Heritage Ventures' public filings. If he has solicited Theodore, he may have other investors. The LLC may have financial activity beyond the trust transfers. Run it, Dom said. Preston's email arrived 3 days later. I was in the appraisal room, back at the ironwork collection. I had returned to it with the focused discipline of someone who understands that the regular work of a life continues even when that life has been temporarily organised around a crisis. The Veve gate panel had given up another secret. A maker's mark pressed into the iron at the inner lower corner of the frame, small and deliberate, the kind of thing you find when you know where to look. I was photographing the mark when my phone buzzed with the email notification. The message was from Preston, copied to what appeared to be his assistant, requesting the firm's annual Heritage Trust review. He had taken the initiative, he wrote, to secure the Pelican Trust conference room and to invite 2 of the bank's senior relationship officers to attend. He wanted to present the fund's positioning with the institutional context it deserved. The meeting was proposed for the following.
Wednesday at 10 o'clock. I think you will find the numbers speak for themselves, Solange, he wrote. I have done the heavy lifting, so you do not have to. I read that sentence twice. Then I set my phone down on the work table and looked at the gate panel for a moment. The maker's mark, patient and precise, surviving 150 years because someone had pressed it there deliberately. Someone who wanted to be found by someone who knew what they were looking at. I picked up my phone and called Dom. He wants a meeting, I said. Pelican Trust conference room Wednesday. He's invited the bank's relationship officers. He wants to present the fund's positioning. A brief silence. He is planning to show you something. He is planning to show me a story, I said. Something that explains the transfers in terms he controls. He does not know we have the transaction map. He does not know about Theodore's affidavit. He does not know we have already spoken to Marcus. He does not know about the compliance notice I sent to Pelican Trust's legal department yesterday, Dom said, and I could hear the particular quality in her voice that I had heard in courtroom stories she had told over 30 years of friendship. The quality of someone who has placed a piece precisely where they intended it and is now watching the board. Their in-house counsel called me this morning. They were not happy about what I described. They were also, notably, not surprised. What does that mean? It means Preston may not be the only compliance problem that bank is currently managing. It means their in-house counsel has strong personal and institutional reasons to want this resolved cleanly. I have asked him to have someone from compliance present at the meeting. Someone who will understand what they are watching. I thought about the conference room at Pelican Trust. I had been there once before, at the Trust's establishment, a glass-walled room that looked out over
the trading floor. Preston had been the one to suggest that location, I remembered now. He liked the backdrop. It positioned him in a certain way. "Tell me what you need me to do," I said. "Reply warmly," Dom said. "Confirm your attendance. Ask if you may bring a couple of family members who want to be more involved. Keep it casual. Give him no reason to prepare differently than he already intends to." I wrote the reply with the same care I give to a provenance report. Every word selected for what it conveyed and what it did not. I told Preston I was looking forward to the meeting, that his preparation was, as always, appreciated, and that I wanted to bring my cousin Theodore, who had expressed interest in being more engaged with the Trust's activities. I hit send. His reply came 20 minutes later. "Absolutely, bring Theodore. The more the merrier. Looking forward to seeing you both Wednesday." I showed Dom the exchange when I arrived at her office that afternoon. She read Preston's reply and permitted herself a small, dry smile. "He has done this before," she said. "He is comfortable in that room. He has a presentation ready, and he is going to walk in expecting to manage 2 women and a retired archivist." She set the phone down. "He has never once considered that you might be someone who keeps records." Marcus had completed his search of Caldwell Heritage Ventures' public filings and brought his findings that evening. 2 additional investors appeared to have contributed capital to the LLC based on Delaware filing amendments made over the previous 8 months. He could not identify them from the public record, but their existence confirmed what Theodore's solicitation had suggested. Preston was operating a fraudulent investment vehicle that the Heritage Fund had bankrolled into existence, and he was actively expanding it. "FINRA received our complaint package this morning," Dom said. "I have been in contact with the staff attorney there who has confirmed receipt and opened a case file. I cannot tell you more than that, but the timeline they work on is faster than civil litigation when the documentation is as organised as ours is." She looked at me steadily. "You did that. The logs, the correspondence records, the time-stamped photographs. That documentation package is why this moves quickly." I nodded. I understood that she was telling me something true and something kind at the same time, which Dom rarely bothers to do. That meant she thought I needed to hear it. That night I drove back to the firm alone. Dom had offered to come with me, in the vague way of someone who does not expect the offer to be accepted. I declined in the equally vague way of someone who needs a particular kind of quiet.
I went to the 2nd floor collection suite, where Mère Celeste's personal favourites are housed. The pieces she bought not as institutional acquisitions, but as acts of private devotion. an 18th century Creole armoire, its cypress wood darkened to the colour of strong coffee, its original iron hardware intact. A set of hand-painted Mardi Gras dance fans, mid-1800s. The pigment still vivid in a way that made your eyes feel the decades they had survived. A framed photograph of the original Thierry shop, circa 1923. My great-grandparents standing outside in the particular formal posture of people who understood that being photographed was a document. Mémé's chair was in the corner, high-backed, upholstered in dark green velvet that had faded unevenly at the armrests. I sat in it. In my bag was the letter. I had retrieved it from the governing documents folder that morning, the one Gustave had given me at the trust establishment. The letter Céleste Thierry had written in her own hand, the hand that had always written with the slightly forward slant of someone trained on fountain pens, when she decided to formalize her life's work into an institution. I had read it many times. I read it now. These things belong to everyone who came before us and everyone who will come after. Guard them as though the past is watching. She had written it without irony and without ceremony, in the same tone she used for recipes and household instructions, and the notes she left on my desk when she wanted me to know something she considered important. The past is watching was not a metaphor to Mémère Céleste. It was a statement about accountability, about the specific quality of obligation that attaches to objects that have outlasted their makers. I folded the letter carefully, set it beside my laptop on the small table I had pulled close to the chair, opened my notes for Wednesday. The armoire stood against the far wall in the climate-controlled quiet, its cypress wood older than any living person in this city. The dance fans hung in their archival frames, the paint surviving because someone, generations ago, had made it to last. The 1923 photograph showed my great-grandparents standing in front of the shop that became this shop, looking at the camera with the expressions of people who intended to be here for a long time. I had never felt the weight of that intention more precisely than I felt it now, and I had never felt more certain, not angry, not afraid, not hurried, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was supposed to do. Wednesday was 3 days away. I opened my notes and began to prepare.
The Pelican Trust conference room is exactly the kind of room Preston Caldwell III would choose for a performance. Glass on 3 sides, polished mahogany oval table, high-backed leather chairs in a shade of charcoal that coordinates with the institution's branding. Through the south-facing windows, the Mississippi moved the way it always moves, brown and indifferent and enormously powerful, carrying everything downstream without commentary. I arrived 12 minutes early and arranged my team the way I arrange an appraisal table, with intention. Dominique took the chair to my immediate left. Marcus sat beside her, his laptop and a neat stack of bound exhibits in front of him. Theodore settled at the far end of my side of the table, upright in the way of a man who has spent decades in archive reading rooms and understands that posture communicates authority. At the opposite end of the table, not on my side, not on Preston's side, but at the head, the position that in a room like
this signals institutional primacy, sat Richard Fonville, Pelican Trust's in-house counsel. Beside him, a compliance officer I knew only as Ms. Broussard, who had introduced herself in the elevator with a handshake that told me everything I needed to know about how the bank felt about what the next hour contained. Fonville had spoken briefly with Dominique before we took our seats. 3 words in passing. "We are ready." Dom had nodded without expression, the way she nods in courtrooms. I set my leather portfolio on the table in front of me. Inside it, face down, organised in the precise order I had determined the night before, were 4 documents. I knew their sequence the way I know the sequence of provenance steps for a significant acquisition. By necessity, by habit, by the understanding that order is not formality. Order is argument.
Preston arrived at 9:58. He came through the glass door with the particular energy of a man who considers promptness a performance rather than a courtesy. Just early enough to project control, just late enough to ensure everyone else is already seated when he enters. He was dressed beautifully. The suit was charcoal wool, a shade that complemented the conference chairs, as though he'd coordinated deliberately, which I suspected he had. The leather portfolio under his arm was the same one he'd carried to our first meeting 2 years ago, monogrammed in gold at the corner. His hair was perfectly placed. His smile arrived before he fully entered the room. "Solange." He crossed to me with the hand already extended, warm, familiar, 2 degrees more affectionate than professional. "You look wonderful, as always." He shook my hand and held it a beat longer than necessary, which I recognized as a dominance signal, so standard it was almost restful to identify. "Theodore, good to see you engaged with all of this. I've always thought the trust benefited from family involvement." Theodore said, "Preston," in a tone that gave him absolutely nothing. Preston glanced along my side of the table, and his smile recalibrated almost imperceptibly, a slight brightening that people perform when they encounter more faces than expected and are deciding whether to be charmed or cautious. He chose charmed. "I don't believe I know everyone." "You'll meet them shortly," I said. "Get set up. We can do introductions when we're ready to begin."
The instruction was mild, and he received it as courtesy. He nodded, moved to the presentation end of the table, and connected his laptop to the room's display screen with the practiced efficiency of a man who has done this in many conference rooms and considers it his natural habitat. The title slide appeared, Heritage Trust, Year 3 Strategic Vision. A dark background, elegant typography, the Thierry-Beaumont Heritage Fund name in tasteful gold serif font. He had spent time on it. He was proud of it. I could see that in the way he straightened when it appeared on the screen. The small proprietary adjustment of a man looking at something he made. "Before we begin," he said, settling into the presenter's position at the head of his side of the table, "I want to say how much I've appreciated your patience over the past year. Trust management at this level requires a long view, and I know the quarterly reports can feel abstract sometimes. That's why I wanted this opportunity to show you the full picture." He smiled. "I think you're going to be pleased." He moved through his opening slides with the fluency of someone who has rehearsed without appearing to rehearse. Alternative asset allocation, patient capital, legacy-aligned portfolio construction. The phrases landed with the practiced weight of language designed to signal expertise without inviting examination. He showed charts, projected growth curves, allocation pie diagrams, a timeline of strategic positioning phases that used the Trust's stated mission language, with the precision of someone who had read the governing document carefully enough to echo it without honouring it. He did not mention the 4 wire transfers. He did not mention Caldwell Heritage Ventures. He presented charts showing growth on assets the trust did not actually hold, in language so fluent and confident that someone who had not spent the previous 11 days sitting with Marcus Fontenot's transaction map might have believed every
word. I watched him the way I watch a piece I already know is wrong. Not with suspicion. Suspicion is for things you're still trying to determine. With documentation, with the particular patience of someone who is not waiting to be surprised because they already know exactly what they're looking at. He had been speaking for 7 minutes when I set the first document on the table, face down, without comment, without ceremony. Preston paused mid-sentence, something about repositioning toward tangible asset classes, and glanced at the paper. His presenter's rhythm stuttered so briefly that only someone watching for it would have noticed. He recovered and continued. I let him. Then I said, Preston, before we go further, I'd like to introduce my team. I turned the document over. It was a copy of the Delaware Incorporation Certificate for Caldwell Heritage Ventures, LLC. The date was printed clearly in the upper right corner of the certificate, 8 days before his appointment as the Heritage Fund's investment advisor, his company name, his registered agent, his stated business purpose, historic property acquisition consulting. I watched his face. The smile did not vanish. That is the thing about certain kinds of men. The smile is a trained response that outlasts the emotion behind it by several seconds. The way a flame holds its shape briefly, even after the fuel is gone. So the smile persisted for a moment, geometric and increasingly structural, before it became something else. Curdled was the word that came to me, the specific transformation of something that was almost right into something unmistakably wrong. Dominique Arsenault, my attorney, I said. Dom did not extend her hand. She held his gaze with the flat professional attention of someone who has looked at men like Preston across tables like this one many times before, and has long since run out of patience for their particular variety of confidence. She filed a civil complaint for breach of fiduciary duty in the 19th Judicial District Court 3 days ago. I set the second document on the table. Marcus Fontenot, forensic accountant. He has documented $1.1 million in unauthorized transfers from the Heritage Fund to your LLC over 14 months. The third document. My cousin Theodore, whom you know, has provided a signed affidavit detailing your verbal representations at 4 quarterly review meetings, representations that directly contradict the fund's actual investment activity. I paused. And Pelican Trust's legal counsel. I nodded toward the far end of the table where Fonville had been, sitting with the stillness of someone conserving energy for a purpose, has already frozen all outgoing transactions from the account pending their internal audit. Fonville did not speak. He did not need to. His presence in that chair at that end of the table had been saying everything since Preston walked into the room. Preston looked at him now with the expression of someone who has just understood, a visual they were looking at incorrectly, the kind of double take that isn't physical but happens entirely behind the eyes. He looked at Ms. Broussard. She slid a document across the table without meeting his eyes. It was the compliance hold on his advisor credentials, issued that morning pending the FINRA investigation. He looked at it and did not pick it up. The room was quiet. Through the south windows, the river went on with its enormous indifferent work. Then Preston Caldwell III did the thing I had anticipated, and the thing that, in some structural way,
I had been waiting for, because it would tell me whether I had read him correctly from the beginning, and I had. He leaned forward. A ghost of the old smile reappeared at the corners of his mouth, the last available expression in a repertoire that was otherwise exhausted. He looked directly at me and he said, "Solange, you're a smart woman, but this fund was complex. You wouldn't have understood the strategy even if I'd explained it to you." The room went completely silent, not the polite silence of people waiting for a speaker to continue. The other kind, the silence that falls when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone present is deciding what it reveals about the person who said it. Theodore's jaw tightened. I saw it in my peripheral vision, the specific tension of a man exercising significant restraint. Marcus set his pen down on the table with a small, precise click. Dominique did not move, did not change expression, did not do anything at all except continue to look at Preston with the quality of attention that courtrooms have taught her to make very uncomfortable. I looked at Preston for a long moment, the unhurried kind, the kind I use when I am examining a piece and have already formed my conclusion and am simply deciding how to document it, what language is most accurate, what record will be most useful, what the object's true nature is now that I've seen it completely. "I appraised the trust document before I signed it," I said. "I identified your breach in 48 hours, and I built the case that ends your career." I paused. Before breakfast. I set the fourth document on the table and slid it across to him. The FINRA complaint, the stamped received date visible in the upper right corner, the case reference number below it. Preston looked at it. He did not touch it. His attorney arrived 22 minutes later, a man in a good suit who had clearly been somewhere else entirely when his phone rang and had come directly. He entered the room, assessed it in approximately 4 seconds with the trained efficiency of someone whose entire professional life is the rapid appraisal of bad situations, leaned down to Preston's ear and said something brief. Preston nodded once. The attorney straightened and addressed the room in the pleasant neutral tone of someone performing a procedure. "My client will not be making any further statements at this time. I'd like to request a brief recess to review the documents on the table." "Of course," Dominique said, in a tone equally pleasant and entirely devoid of accommodation. Preston left without looking at me again. That told me something I had already known. The civil complaint moved through the Louisiana District Court with the methodical momentum of a process that has been well prepared. Disgorgement, as Dom had explained during our first meeting in her office, is not merely the return of what was stolen. It is the surrender of everything derived from the wrongful act, the $1.1 million Preston had transferred, and every dollar Caldwell Heritage Ventures had generated from the use of those funds during the period they were held. Marcus's forensic accounting established that figure with a precision Preston's own LLC records, subpoenaed by the court, confirmed. He could not dispute the arithmetic. His attorneys, recognizing that the evidence was organized to a standard that would play very well in front of a jury, recommended settlement. Dom called me on a Thursday morning to tell me. I was in the appraisal room, sitting with a set of daguerreotypes that had arrived from a Natchitoches estate, when my phone rang. "He settled," she said. "Full recovery. Every dollar plus legal costs and a negotiated contribution to the Trust's acquisition fund in lieu of the punitive damages we would have sought at trial. I set down the daguerreotype I was holding and looked at it for a moment. A woman, mid-1800s, formal posture, an expression that was simultaneously composed and privately amused, as though she were thinking something she had decided not to say. "When is the wire coming?" "It's already in the Pelican Trust account," Dom said. "I confirmed with Fonville 20 minutes ago." The FINRA investigation ran its parallel course with the efficiency that Dominique had anticipated. Preston's firm, once notified by regulators, placed him on administrative leave within 48 hours and launched its own independent investigation. The internal inquiry, which had access to account records Dom and Marcus had not yet been able to subpoena, surfaced 2 additional client accounts with
transfer patterns nearly identical to ours. 2 other families, 2 other sets of assets, quietly redirected to Caldwell Heritage Ventures over the same 14-month period. FINRA's findings, issued 3 months after our complaint was filed, resulted in Preston's suspension as a registered investment advisor, pending the outcome of regulatory proceedings. His firm terminated his employment before the suspension notice was formally published. I read the suspension notice on a Friday afternoon. I did not feel the thing I might have expected to feel. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, something quieter. The clean feeling of an account that has been correctly balanced. The $1.1 million came back to the Heritage Fund, and then it went to work.
Dominique helped us amend the trust document in the weeks following the settlement. The new instrument required co-signature authorization for all transfers regardless of amount. The loophole Preston had built into the original contract was closed with language Gustave Melançon had wished he'd insisted on the first time. Mandatory quarterly reporting was required to go to all named beneficiaries, not merely be made available upon request. An independent trustee review every 18 months, conducted by a qualified professional with no financial relationship to the fund's investment advisor. We also restructured the advisor appointment process to require disclosure of all affiliated entities at the time of appointment, with annual updates, the step that would have surfaced Caldwell Heritage Ventures before Preston ever touched $1 of the fund. Dom reviewed the amended document 3 times. "Now it looks like what it was always supposed to be," she said. "The 2 collections had been on the firm's acquisition list for years. Pieces I had been tracking through dealers and estate contacts with the patient, longing that serious collectors know, the awareness of things you believe in that you cannot yet afford to bring home. The first was a set of 19th century Louisiana Creole silver, 7 pieces, their maker's marks tracing 3 generations of free black silversmiths who had worked in New Orleans between 1810 and 1865. The second was a rare assemblage of early 20th century African American folk art from the Mississippi Delta, carvings, paintings on salvaged wood, 2 embroidered textile pieces that the folk art scholars I'd consulted described as among the finest surviving examples of their tradition. Both collections arrived on a Tuesday in January, crated and climate packed, and I was in the receiving room when they were opened.
Theodore was there. He put his hands on his knees and leaned forward and looked at the silver for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Mère would have cried. She would have made us catalogue them first and cried later," I said. He laughed, which was the right sound for that room on that day. 3 months after the conference room confrontation, I am in the back appraisal room with Theodore and two young women who arrived at 8 o'clock this morning with the particular combination of competence and uncertainty that graduate students carry in the early weeks of something new. Their names are Amara and Celestine. Celestine, which made Theodore look at me with an expression he didn't try to hide. They are completing internships with the firm through a partnership I established with Xavier University, structured and funded through the Heritage Trust's expanded community engagement budget, which is one of the amendments we made when we rewrote the document, bringing young scholars into direct contact with the collection, making the work continuous across generations. Amara is at the side table with the Delta Folk Art Assemblage, working through the cataloguing protocol I taught them both on their first day. Celestine is holding a carved wooden figure, a river ferryman, roughly 18 inches tall, made from a single piece of dense hardwood, darkened by age and handling. His body angled slightly forward, with the posture of someone leaning into a current, a long pole in his extended hands, his face wearing an expression that has been travelling through time for approximately 100 years, and has arrived at this room with its meaning entirely intact. The ferryman knows something. You can see it in the set of his carved mouth. Not a smile, not a frown, but the expression of a man who has crossed the river many times and understands the river does not care whether you respect it. Celestine studies the face for a moment and then looks up at me. What's it worth? I take the figure from her hands and hold it in my cotton gloves, turning it once in the climate-controlled light of the appraisal room. I examine the base, the tool marks along the pole, the way the grain of the wood follows the carve of the figure's coat. I already know its auction estimate from the acquisition documentation. That is not the question she is actually asking, and she doesn't quite know yet that she's asking something larger. That depends, I say, on whether you're asking about the market value or the cultural value. Those are two very different numbers. Celestine is writing something in her cataloguing notebook, the green-covered kind I recommended they both buy, the habit my father gave me that I am giving forward. She looks up. Someone has to know the difference between them, I say, or the people who don't care about either will decide for you. She nods slowly and writes something else. Amara at the side table has paused with a painted wood panel in her hands and is listening without turning around, which tells me she is learning well. Theodore is in the corner chair with a reference catalogue open in his lap, and he catches my eye over the top of his reading glasses, the ones he claims he doesn't need, which he has been claiming for 15 years. He smiles, the particular smile of someone who recognizes a thing being passed carefully from one set of hands to another. I hand the ferryman back to Celestine. He resumes his crossing, pole extended, face carrying whatever it is he knows about the river and the current and the long, patient work of getting people from one side to the other. He has been watching the water for 100 years. He knows it doesn't stop. He knows it doesn't forgive. He knows that the only thing that matters in the end is who's paying attention on the bank and whether they understand what they're actually looking at.